Hey guys, Modelling Weekly here, and welcome to a very special extra long build video. It's been a tough year for the channel, with my attention focused mostly on my studies at university. However, pockets of modelling here and there have thankfully culminated with this, a full build of Airfix's massive 1/24th scale Spitfire Mk.IXc. In this video, I'll be taking you guys through every step of the process, detailing how I constructed, painted, weathered and completed this wonderful kit. It's also a very relevant day to be releasing this video, being the 80th anniversary of Operation Overlord, the landings that this build will commemorate. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. When I started this kit way back in July of 2023, I was most excited to check out the insane levels of detail that everyone had been talking about. And well, it definitely looks very impressive. Being tooled in the UK as opposed to overseas, the overall quality control and resolution of the detail was truly remarkable. I found no imperfections in my kit, and overall I was very pleased with what I saw. Some parts did feature a slight orange peel texture on the surface, which I was slightly worried about. However, this wasn't noticeable by the end of the build. The clear parts were equally impressive, featuring some lovely rivet detail on the canopy frames themselves. Airfix has even offered two variants of the middle canopy section, one featuring the correct shape but with a seam line down the middle, or one with a slightly less convex shape and no seam line. Finally, the decals are also looking very nice. They are very well organised, and for the most part the colours look good to me. The blue is slightly off, however I'll be spraying these roundels on, so I'm not too fussed. So, on with the exciting part, the build itself. As you just saw with the title card, I'll be splitting this build up into chapters as it's almost an hour long, and this way it'll be much easier not only to keep track of the build, but to refer back to certain points if you ever have to. Starting off with the first chapter in the cockpit, a little bit of assembly and minor modification was necessary before I could begin any painting. This involved drilling out the holes in the ribs that lined the fuselage, which in the kit are only represented by slight indentations on the parts in question. This was carried out with my cheap Dremel tool, which I got from Amazon a while back. Some smaller sub-assemblies were also necessary at this stage, such as the construction of the seat, along with the addition of some smaller detail parts, of which there were quite a few in this kit. I also installed the wall onto one side of the cockpit tub, which clicked into place with a very nicely designed joining method. The fit overall up to this point was definitely impressive. Massive kudos to the designers for designing such a lovely interior. Although the detail overall is fantastic, there were some smaller electrical lines missing, so I quickly added these with some very fine gauge lead wire, which is great for bending into complicated shapes such as this. With that done, I could begin laying down some black primer. This was applied to all areas of the cockpit in order to provide a nice solid base for further colours, as well as a starting point for some shading. As per usual, I made use of my trusty Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black for this task, as it provides the smoothest results out of all the primers that I've tested. And with that coat dry, we can move straight onto some of that shading that I just mentioned. There's various ways you can add variation to your paint layers, each offering different final results and effects. However, for the interior, I went with a basic pre-shading technique, where I mottled white paint onto the centres of any panels, as well as areas where light would hit the strongest. This will create some lovely forced shadows in the final paint layer, as well as slightly desaturating it, giving it a slightly worn appearance. You'll see this start to take shape with the first layer of interior green. The interior green that I made use of for this build was Tamiya's XF71, which is technically for Japanese subjects I believe, but I'm a big fan of the shade so it doesn't really bother me. The critical aspect of this stage was to apply the colour in various very thin layers, building it up gradually and preventing it from completely obscuring the pre-shading underneath. This is the biggest mistake many people make when pre-shading their models. They completely cover up the work that they did before. The Spitfire's interior, for the most part, is made up of two tones. A silver protective lacquer, I believe, along with the standard RAF interior green. As a result, the green was masked off and protected with frog tape, allowing me to apply the silver paint. For this purpose, I made use of some Mr. Colour Super Metallic Superfine Silver, which ideally should have been on a gloss black undercoat, but it's not the end of the world, especially as it's not going to be too visible in the end. I should also mention that for the metallic shades, clear coats and primers, I made use of a 0.4mm nozzle mounted on my Harder & Steenbeck Ultra in order to accommodate for the larger particle size. All airbrushing was carried out at around 20 to 30 psi throughout the entire build. Following the demasking process, some further forced shadows were added and accentuated with an ammo ink shader, which can be sprayed straight from the bottle in very thin layers. As you can see, it produces a pretty nice result in the end. At this point, I began paying some attention to the instrument panel, which up to this point was still sitting in its black primed state. The first order of business was adding some forced shadows, making use of my 0.15mm Harder & Steenbeck, loaded with Tamiya German Grey. The dials could then be added one by one, which was a nice touch from Airfix, as this removed the danger of the carrier film silvering that could occur if they were all joined together. These decals were set into place using a combination of microset and sol. Once they were all applied, a flat clear coat of GX114 was used to seal them all in place, preparing them for my next trick, which involved some thick blobs of GX100 gloss. Using both a toothpick and a fine brush, I applied small amounts of very slightly thin GX100 onto the individual dials and glass covers, simulating, well, the glass itself. Once dry, this will produce a very convincing end result, which in my opinion is way more effective than a photo-etched instrument panel, which at this scale can be very pricey. Moving back onto the rest of the cockpit now, my next job was to paint up the pilot's seat into a more convincing appearance. As this would be a very visible element of the cockpit in the final display piece, I decided to go absolutely to town on replicating the leather and fabrics on this part. The first stage was to block in both the leather brown and dark grey elements, which was done using brush painted Bioco acrylics, mixed and thinned using my handy wet palette. This stuff goes down beautifully, leaving no brush strokes if you thin it correctly. Next, it was the return of German Grey forced highlights. Making sure not to cause any overspray, which was aided with some masking tape, I carefully picked out the individual seat pads, making the backrest appear less like a big monotonous grey lump. As you can see in the video, this is already starting to look far more interesting. I didn't stop there, however, as in the next layer I added even lighter grey highlights, which were focused around the top of the seat, blended downwards. At this point, I also began giving the brown leather section some attention, with its own round of highlights formed by a mixture of flat earth and buff from Tamiya, bringing it up to speed with the rest of the seat. In order to really enhance the leather effect, the next step involved bringing back the good old paintbrush. Using a flat edge, along with a dry brushing style approach, I created some wear and tear on the seat cushions, imitating the cracks that usually form on leather surfaces that have been exposed to tough conditions. And to cap off this mini leather painting tutorial, some finer and more calculated cracks were added with a superfine paintbrush. Doesn't look half bad in the end, I reckon. A similar technique to the leather crack method was also employed when it came to adding damage to the interior green paint in the rest of the cockpit, particularly in areas that tended to receive most abrasion. I find that using a fine brush in situations like this instead of a sponge really pushes the effect to another level, as a sponge is far more random than the calculated and precise application that you get with a fine paintbrush. Granted, it takes a lot longer. However, in my opinion, the extra time is definitely worth it in the end result. You can even add additional focused layers of chipping, as seen in the video. As a continuation to this interior weathering, the next order of business was a standard pin wash, which really helps to not only accentuate any smaller details, but also to further push those forced shadows, adding an extra element of depth to the cockpit. This wash was applied using a fine brush and was created from scratch using white spirit and Abteilung 502 oils. In this case, sepia with a little tiny bit of black. Any excess could easily be removed using a white spirit dampened brush, which simultaneously allowed me to do a bit of blending, rather than removing all of the oil paint entirely. This is a great way of simulating dirt deposits and general grime, which is something that I highlight in my full oil wash guide, if you fancy checking that out after this video. I was pretty happy with how it turned out, so the next order of business involved a bit of assembly. Everything clicked together very nicely with very little persuasion, so I was really happy to see this. For the most part, this build was constructed straight out of the box, as I wanted to show you guys the great detail that is featured. However, the one element that I did go into the aftermarket domain for were the seat belts. The kit includes plastic ones, which are alright, however they're really thick to a point where they're really out of scale, and feature essentially no detail, so I think it's definitely worth replacing these if you can. They were fixed into place using clear CA glue so as to not ruin the paint job on the seat, and a pair of tweezers was used to bend them into shape once the glue had dried. With that, the seat assembly could be glued into place, which was a really exciting point in the build, as the cockpit tub was really coming together at this point. This is something that I actually really liked about this kit. It's very well detailed, however it doesn't feature too many tiny assemblies that you have to sink all your time into, and instead you can make some pretty serious progress into the build in a relatively short amount of time. I know that's ironic given how long I spent on it, but there you go. On the other hand, however, I soon encountered my first serious gripe with the kit, and it involved the fit between the two fuselage halves. Everything up to this point had fitted beautifully, including the cockpit tub into the right fuselage half, but for whatever reason, the area ahead of the cockpit where the fuel tank is situated simply refused to play ball. I was left with a really annoying gap and a slightly stepped joint, which did require a few rounds of filler and sanding to deal with. This isn't the end of the world, however it is a bit annoying to see this on a pretty modern kit which was also tooled in the UK. The rear fuselage joint, however, as seen now in the video, simply required a light bit of sanding to produce a great finish, so at least the kit slightly redeemed itself in this regard. A final bit of airframe construction could then take place, which included the fitting of both the horizontal stabilizers and the rudder, which were all assembled out of two pieces. This was slightly annoying, but it was understandable for a 24th scale kit. And with that, the first chapter of the video is complete, and it only took 15 minutes. That's some remarkable speed right there. Jokes aside though, I really hope you enjoyed that first segment, and let's prepare to move on to the next, which features the construction of the wings. As it turned out, the wing construction in this kit actually features some of the best engineering on display throughout it. The entire internal structure is made up of aerofoil-shaped wing ribs, along with a main wing spar, which is not only realistic and adds a lot of detail, but it also means the wing as a whole is very robust and well structured. Some elements required a little bit of persuasion to get into place, but on the whole it was a very well thought out process. The wing spar itself helped massively in obtaining an accurate dihedral angle, as the upper and lower wing surfaces fitted directly onto it in order to maintain a good shape. Overall, I was very pleased with how the wings came together. When it came to priming the interior wing areas, I once again returned to the old reliable Mr. Surfacer 1500 lacquer primer, this time mixed with a few drops of gloss clear coat in order to ensure a smooth and slightly glossy finish. This would ensure that the following metallic paint would have a nice shine to it. The metallic paint in question this time, however, was not superfine silver. Instead, I resorted to a stainless steel shade, which is similar, however is a bit darker and somewhat dirtier silver. This decision was made in order to make the gun and gear bays appear more worn out and grimier, matching the overall aesthetic that I'd be going for later on in the build. It would also provide a nice base for some fresh aluminium chips to be made with a brush later on. Now, I have no idea if this is accurate at all, but when it came to detailing the rims around the gun bay doors, I opted for an interior green shade instead of the silver that the instruction booklet suggested. This was purely an artistic choice, as I thought that the variation in tones would add some kind of nice interest. Kind of similar to how some American aircraft have a mix of zinc chromate and silver in their gun bays and wheel wells. The hardcore Spitfire fans among you will be fuming, but I thought it looked pretty nice in the end. With those basic shades patched in, I could move on to some more focused painting, including blocking in the very dark grey shade that I used for both the 20mm Hispanos and the Brownings mounted in the wings. These were all brush painted, along with the ammunition feeds that were on display next to the Hispano cannons. Again, I have no idea if these belt combinations are accurate. However, I painted them up as a mixture of high explosive and incendiary rounds, based on some reference photos I found online. I'm sure that there must have been some certain missions where this combination of rounds were loaded. However, upon research, it appears that most common combination was HE, incendiary, and AP. However, I didn't find anything conclusive, so feel free to comment anything you know down below. With all the guns fitted into the wings, I gave them all a quick silver dry brush, which is a very common method used to give metal objects a more metallic appearance. It's low effort, but the results definitely aren't bad. I could then move on to a bit of grime weathering, in the form of another sepia oil wash made from Abteilung 502. There wasn't a huge amount of detail in the wings that I could apply this to, however it did make the overall appearance more interesting, which was nice to see. Any excess was again removed with a white spirit dampened brush. Following the usual application of the oil wash, I also decided to add further interest by spattering some of the same concoction across the gun bays using a toothpick. This added another level of depth to these areas, giving the impression that they've been worked on and serviced for a long time. With that, it was time to join the lower half of the wings up with the fuselage from earlier, which was a very easy process thanks to the wing spar aligner that was joined to the firewall ahead of the fuel tank. The tops of the wings could then be pressed on one by one, which was fairly easy, however the wing roots did need some playing with before they could be deemed acceptable. Remember the chipping I mentioned earlier? Well, it's time for a bit of that now, and I was really pleased with how it looked against the heavily weathered stainless steel surface. This process almost felt like adding white to a dark painting, creating an enhanced level of shininess thanks to the dulled surroundings. I'll definitely be using this method again at some point. The wingtips and control surfaces could then be added, bringing the construction of the wings and chapter 2 of this video to a neat close. As you just saw in the title card, Chapter 3 of this extra long build is probably one of the most exciting. It is of course the absolutely iconic Rolls-Royce Merlin. This kit features a fantastic representation of the classic engine, covered with some lovely details that we'll dive into now. A lot of the engine's initial build features components that come in two halves, so it was inevitable that some filling would be required. This was carried out with the same VMS rubberized CA that I used earlier on with the fuselage, which was then left to dry for around 12 hours before a series of sanding sponges could be used to remove any excess. This process took a little while as there was a lot to do, but it was definitely worth it in the end. It was then time for yet another new technique to be introduced. In order to give the engine a heavier and more effective cast appearance, I made use of some unthinned Mr. Surfacer 1500 grey, stippled onto the cast surfaces of the engine, creating a very subtle pitted effect that really helped to add some variety to its appearance. With the preparation of the individual components done, a bit of assembly could take place now. This began with fixing the two cylinder banks together, initially joined by the fuel-air mixture inlets, which gave the cylinder banks the 30-degree angle that they required. This assembly was then fixed into place on the crankcase, followed by the wheel housing that drives the supercharger, which made its appearance immediately afterwards. The carburetor could then be popped onto the back of the supercharger, completing the construction of the major engine components. Whilst I built the engine almost entirely out of the box thanks to its fantastic design, there was one change I did make, and that was replacing the outer ignition wiring with some more realistic braided cable. The first step in carrying out this modification was to drill out the holes for the wires to sit inside of, for which I used a 0.5mm drill bit mounted inside a low-speed Dremel. This was a very tedious process. Now, I know what you're thinking. What's with the colour choice? I know it looks ridiculous, but once painted up, this pink cord will be the perfect representation of the actual ignition cables. They were a little bit fiddly to install as they didn't seem to fuse very well with the CA that I was using. However, after a few hours of very frustrating work, I did manage to get them to stay in place. The completed ignition assemblies could then be fixed onto the sides of the cylinder banks via the magnetos, and following a little bit of camera trickery and editing, here we have some perfect ignition cables. Right, enough building, let's get down to the good stuff and paint this thing up. Again, no points for anyone who could guess the primer I'd be using. As per the rest of the video, the Merlin was initially primed with a well-thinned layer of Mr. Surfacer 1500 black, which was essential in unifying both the pink braided cables and the slightly lighter grey cast texture with the rest of the plastic. It was a little tricky to hit all of the angles necessary on this engine, as there were a lot of details, but I managed to fully prime it eventually. It looks pretty good with a splash of black primer, I reckon. This was only the beginning, however, as the next stage consisted of adding a little bit more variation to the surface. This time I brought out the very versatile light gull grey shade from Tamiya, which was used to slightly mottle the surface and further highlight the cast texture that I added previously. This was a very important stage as the engine is essentially a big black lump of metal, so adding some extra visual interest couldn't go amiss. The 0.15mm Harder & Steenbeck nozzle was once again used for this stage in order to get that extra element of control. The Merlin was of course black and not grey, so the next step was to blend this mottled layer all together with a coat of Mr. Colour Cowling Black, which is a slightly bluish grey black shade, perfect for this application. Using a pure black shade would have been a bit harsh on the eyes here, so using this slightly dulled tone would help to unify the engine with the rest of the build. Another element of visual interest could then be introduced through the silver bolt heads and fasteners featured all over the engine. I presume these weren't painted as any maintenance would simply scratch off the paint layer anyway. However, I've seen pictures of some Merlins that do feature painted bolts, so I presume this depended on when and where it was manufactured, and was essentially random. If you know anything about this, feel free to comment it in the comment section down below. A Bioco tan shade was then loaded onto a paintbrush to tackle the ignition wires, which I reckon looked pretty good in the end with that extra bit of added texture. If you switch the video resolution to 4K now, you'll be able to see the true effect of these little wires, which I'm pretty glad about, as they definitely took long enough to install. The slightly more hidden inner ignition wires could then be installed onto the top of the engine, serving the inner spark plugs. When it came to weathering the Merlin, my vision from the get-go was to create the effect of a well-used, yet well-maintained engine, featuring certain build-ups of dust, dirt and grime, however not to the point where it appears to be in disrepair. This weathering was initiated with a light coat of brown enamel wash, which was then blended into that cast texture using a white spirit dampened brush. Overall, this helped to set up a solid initial layer for the following weathering stages, which would build upon the basic dirt effect. A tiny amount of ammo rust effects were up next, which helped to push the idea of a well-used engine, suggesting that some rainwater may have found its way onto the cylinder banks during routine servicing, or something along those lines. Again, however, this effect was limited and very restrained in order to help achieve the look that I was going for. White spirit was again used to blend it into the surface more effectively, having been left for a few minutes to dry. The final weathering effect that I made use of on the engine was an Decaling 502 dust wash, applied and cleaned up in the same fashion as the other two enamel effects. This helped to represent any dirt left over from the aircraft's operations during the summer months, where the airfields would have been dustier and drier overall. The coolant header tank could then be installed, completing the direct construction of the Merlin itself. An engine is no good without an aircraft, however, so the next process involved creating the frame that the Merlin would sit in once fixed to the rest of the Spitfire. I have to say, the way Airfix designed this section was very impressive. The instructions made it very clear that the Merlin itself should be used as a guide, allowing for a perfectly shaped cradle to be achieved. This was then sprayed up with Mr. Surfacer yet again, followed by a slightly mottled layer of interior green, which was intentionally sprayed more heavily where the light would hit it most, again bringing in those forced shadows and highlights, aided by the black undercoat. The big brass coolant pipes that run down the sides of the engine were a bit trickier to paint than the rest of it. They're supposed to have a nice brass colour, as I mentioned, however I didn't have a brass shade at my disposal, so I had to opt for a longer-winded approach. The parts were initially coated with Mr. Super Metallic stainless steel, followed by a mixture of clear red and orange acrylics from Tamiya. This clear mixture, when applied in thin layers, provided the exact effect that I was going for, without having to obtain the specialised paint for it. Just be careful not to overcoat the paints if you're trying this out yourself, as it can start to look way more orange than brass. These painted tubes could then be threaded into the engine cradle, which wasn't exactly easy. They must have warped slightly in the box, as they didn't fit exactly right, meaning quite a bit of CA glue had to be used to hold them in place. You can kind of see that in the second clip. Despite this, however, I managed to get it all working in the end, and I could move on to a spot of detail painting. This involved using a lightened form of the cockpit green from earlier, along with a superfine brush in order to add some micro scratches and highlights all over the monotonous green cradle. As you can see in the video, even a small amount of variation can turn something into an interesting thing to look at. Finally, I finished off the cradle and the engine build with a return of the Tamiya dark brown pin wash, which was used to pick out some of those lovely rivet details found along the sides of the cradle structure. Excess was blended in afterwards using a white spirit dampened brush yet again. Now, you may think that's the engine build section over, but don't forget the propeller itself. I could have built this sub-assembly up in the end of the video, however, I decided to throw it together now, not only for completeness, but also to try out an effect that I'd be using later on in the build as well. I wanted to make sure that it would work with the Mk.IXc lacquer paints that I'd be using. I'll explain this in more detail shortly. Following a primer layer, all the components that make up the propeller were sprayed with a layer of stainless steel metallic paint. This would serve as the base of the chipping effect that I intended to create. In order to achieve this goal, I made use of Tumbrol's chipping fluid for the first time ever. I sprayed 2 layers of the compound over the top of a satin varnish layer, leaving the chipping medium to dry for around 2 hours before proceeding. At first, it seemed really foamy and bubbly, and I was worried that the effect wouldn't work. However, after a while it did seem to settle down, and I could apply the first top coat, which came in the form of Mk.IXc's RF Sky shade for the propeller spinner. I made sure to spray this colour, along with the Mk.IXc black used on the blades, as thin as possible in order to maximise the chance that the medium would work in the end. A little bit of variation was added to both the spinner and blades using an AK mottling stencil, which is a quick and easy method of adding a bit of visual interest to a surface without too much effort. This was followed by the application of the yellow propeller tip markers, which were masked off and initially primed with Mr. Surfacer 1500 Pink. This may seem odd at first, however pink is actually the best undercoat possible for the yellow acrylic paint that followed. Keep this in mind for whenever you're spraying something with a lot of yellow involved. I then set to work on assembling the propeller, initially by installing the rotor hub along with the spinner to seal it off completely. This was an absolutely pain-free process with 0 fit issues. This is great to see, and it made me like the kit even more. The blades themselves were no different, slotting right into place with keyed installation holes, so it was impossible to screw this up. I could then set to work with a toothpick and some water, crossing my fingers and hoping that the chipping fluid would work through a layer of lacquer paint. And to my delight, it did in fact work. It was a little bit tricky and required soaking with warm water for quite a while, however the effect did work and I reckon it came out pretty nicely. Completing this stage marked the end of the Merlin build for this video, along with the end of Chapter 3. Before we move on to Chapter 4, I'd just like to say a massive thanks to all of my amazing Modelling Weekly channel members here on YouTube. Your support over the past year has been truly incredible, despite the tough time that the channel has been through. I really appreciate it. If you'd like to find out more about what being a channel member entails, feel free to click the link in the description down below to discover the perks available to you. These range from early access videos to exclusive member-only content, including an extended cut of the Cockpit and Merlin builds from this video, featuring lots of background information and unseen footage. For only £1.99 per month, I reckon that's a pretty decent deal. No pressure though, as simply watching these videos helps me fund the next big project, so a massive thanks goes out to all of you for watching at home. Right, back to the video and on with Chapter 4. It's finally time to lay down some paint on this airframe. There was of course some prep required before we could start, however this was fairly pain-free as a lot of the covers that were included in the kit could be utilised, especially on the wings. I was also feeling lazy and decided to buy a vinyl mask set for the canopy, so masking this was also completed in a matter of minutes rather than a matter of hours. These masks lined up perfectly with the moulded strut, so no complaints here. The canopy sections were temporarily fixed into place using PVA glue, as I would need to remove the interior masks following the painting stage later on. When it comes to the primer, you're in for a shocker. I know, it's not black. At this point in the build, I had run out of my black primer, and it turned out that there hadn't been a shipment of Mr. Surfacer black primer to the UK for a few months at the time of painting, so I couldn't find it anywhere. Instead, I mixed a whole pot of AKRC black paint with the rest of my Mr. Surfacer mahogany that I had left, and sprayed this instead. This came out very nicely, so I was actually pretty happy with the chain of events in the end. Before any actual colour could be laid down, I had to prepare for the chipping that I mentioned earlier. Focused on high traffic areas of the Spitfire's surface, I sprayed the same super metallic stainless steel as before, which would hopefully imitate a worn out aluminium surface. I made sure to photograph the exact areas that I'd sprayed, so that I knew where to add the chips afterwards. This was again followed by a matte varnish layer, which was left to dry and then topped with some Humbrol chipping fluid. The same brown primer from earlier was then used to unify the metallic sections with the surface, as it would fuse with the following paint layers and all come off as one, so this was no issue. Now, time for some proper paintwork. As the underside featured the lightest of the three camouflage colours, I began here with some highly focused mottling, using the rivets as guides on where to apply the paint. As you'll see throughout the painting stage for this build, my workflow remained largely the same for each camouflage colour. The first step consisted of some initial mottling using the base colour from the pot, in this case medium sea grey, which was used to add some basic interest to the surface and to begin suggesting areas of lighter, convex metal around the rivet lines, along with the darker concave sections where the skin has been stressed. This effect would be pushed further in the next stage, which featured a lightened version of the base colour. Instead of applying this shade everywhere, it was focused more towards the rivet lines, further enhancing the stressed skin effect that I was going for. The edge of each box that I chose to make the lightest was completely random, further enhancing the visual interest on the underside. All of this detail work was carried out using a superfine 0.15mm nozzle, along with heavily thinned paint, allowing for a huge amount of control. The second to last technique utilised on the underside consisted of highlighting certain boxes with a random series of blue shades, further enhancing the overall tonal variation. With all of that detail work on the underside complete, a final layer of the original medium sea grey shade was misted over in order to unify all the different colours. This was applied very gradually, with pauses to inspect how it was looking, as I didn't want to obscure the variation too much like I have done in the past. Now for the slightly darker grey that formed one half of the two-tone camouflage on the top side. I'm using the exact same techniques here, so I won't mention what I'm doing in quite as much detail. However, what I will talk about is how I tackle the demarcation lines between colours. As this is 1/24th scale, I opted for a freehand approach, as masking putty in this situation would create an unrealistically sharp effect. I began by lightly marking out the edges of the grey tone across the whole model, giving me a visual representation of the boundaries I had to stick within. These could shift slightly throughout the process, however, so it's not a fixed affair. I then employed my pre-shading processes up to and against these boundaries, changing nothing about how I was applying them. The only difficulty did occur when it came to the highlights, as I had to stop myself from being tempted to stop short of the demarcation boundaries. However, this wasn't too bad in the end after I got used to it. The fine nozzle size definitely aided me massively throughout this process, so I'd definitely recommend it if you're trying this at home. Again, the pre-shading was capped off with some random blue highlights, this time consisting of slightly darker shades, as it was of course a slightly darker shade of grey that I was adding variation to. I mainly used Tamiya blue grey throughout this process, sprayed fairly thick to build up that colour. And finally, the colour was completed yet again by misting the heavily thinned base shade over the specified areas, building up the uniformity until it matched the level that I had achieved on the underside. I have to say I was slightly disappointed with the AKRC shade in this case, as the final colour was nowhere near as dark as I had hoped, or that was advertised on the bottle. Some weathering should fix this, however. Now it's time to repeat the process for the third time. The camouflage green shade was replicated again using the AKRC offering. However, I'm glad to say I was happy with the tone of this one. It was sprayed very carefully in the gaps that I'd left before, making sure that my airbrush nozzle was as close to the surface as possible when it came to creating those demarcation edges. I also made sure to clear any nozzle blockages, as a sudden misfire could be pretty bad in this situation. Adding the lighter highlights was probably one of the hardest parts of this camouflage, as I had to simultaneously focus on creating a nice mottled effect, whilst also maintaining the edges that I'd made before. There were areas where this didn't go that well, so it's definitely not perfect. However, I'd say I'm fairly pleased with how it came out in the end, despite the weird colour tones. As per usual, the final pre-shading stage was to add some colour variation to certain panels. For the green, I switched to an AKRC olive drab shade, which should give some panels the appearance of being sun-faded, adding to the aircraft's overall visual appearance. And then it was time to seal it all in with the final layer. I had to be really careful with this, as I didn't want to focus it too much by positioning the airbrush really close to the model, but at the same time I had to keep those sharp camo lines, which required me to do exactly that. After a while, however, I did manage to put together a fairly convincing effect by varying the distance between my airbrush and the model. So that's the main camo done, on with the markings. I knew from the start that I'd be spraying these on instead of using the decals, as I simply couldn't risk jeopardizing those lovely rivet details. Also, spraying your own roundels allows you to add tonal variation, so why not? The masks were cut using a set of vernier calipers to measure the kit supplied decals, and transferred these measurements onto a compass cutter. I then cut out the required circles from some yellow frog tape, which worked fantastically in maintaining some sharp edges. The first shade that I applied, as you can see here, was the trainer yellow featured around the outside of the fuselage roundels. However, I quickly moved on to spraying the classic blue and red found on all of them. These blue and red shades consisted of custom Tamiya mixes, based on a recipe from an old Brit modeler forum that I can't find anymore, so you'll have to experiment in forming your own colours. The blue was the first to be sprayed, forming an initial base layer on which a lighter blue shade could be added for variation, similar to how the main camouflage colours were formed. The rivet lines were again used as references, forming boxes that imitated the skin stretching that the aircraft would endure. A final layer of the initial blue mixture could then be sprayed over the top, completing the blue sections of the RAF roundels. I then of course moved on to the red centre sections, again using a custom paint mixture, along with a very similar workflow and overall process. The base layer took a little longer to build up, as the blue was much darker than the camouflage that it had been sprayed on. However, it was fine once I'd added the highlights, along with the blending layer across the top. Not too shabby. The next masking endeavour that I had to undertake was creating the invasion stripes. The trickiest part about making these was definitely cutting out a set of masking strips of uniform thickness, as I didn't have any masking tape that was the correct width to go off from the start. Once I had these, however, it was pretty easy sailing. The white paint could be sprayed across the entire invasion stripe surface, and once this was mottled, painted and dried, I could install the pre-cut masking strips and do the same for the black stripes. These were formed using an AKRC black base layer. However, the final effect was enhanced with some German grey mottling, and then blended back in with some black so that the overall colour wasn't as stark against the rest of the paint scheme. A quick tip when it comes to spraying with masks like this is to stay as vertical as possible. That way, even if a tiny opening appears along one of the masks, overspray shouldn't occur if you're spraying directly down onto it. That is, unless your paint is super thin. Following the invasion stripes, I also quickly added the leading edge gun markers using yellow and dark red tones. However, I didn't film this as it's much the same process as the rest of the masked sections. So, with all that painting done, it was finally time for the moment of truth. Would the chipping fluid still work despite all of that paint piled on top of it? And I'm glad to say the answer was indeed yes. Again, it did need quite a bit of soaking with warm water. However, after a while, it did start to lift off very easily. I found that using a metal object like a pair of pointed tweezers also helped massively. I focused the chipping around areas that would receive the most wear and tear, primarily around the wing roots, as this were the areas where the airmen and mechanics would be clambering onto the aircraft on a daily basis. Following this, all the paintwork was sealed in and protected with a nice uniform coat of GX100 gloss, preparing the aircraft for any remaining decals that needed applying, bringing chapter 4 of this video to a neat close. As I just mentioned, the next chapter of this build will feature a combination of the decaling stage, along with a bit of weathering to really pull this build together. As I'd already sprayed a lot of the markings using stencils, the only decals left to apply at this stage were the lettering, along with any stencil data that had been left off. Having been manufactured by Cartograph, these decals were absolutely pain-free to apply, and with the addition of some microset and sol, they settled down into the surface details very nicely. Some decals, such as the no-step markers, did need slight modification due to the openings in the wings. However, this wasn't a huge deal at all, and with a bit of playing around, they worked just fine. After allowing the decals to dry for around 12 hours, I protected them with a nice coat of GX100 matte varnish, which also helped in returning the Spitfire's paint job to a more realistic sheen. This was applied using a wider 0.4mm nozzle, as I mentioned before. Now, time for some more exciting stuff. As I mentioned earlier on in the painting process, the ocean grey used on top of the Spitfire seemed oddly bright despite having used the correct shade. As a result, I was looking forward to the oil washing stage to help unify it and bring it back down to the correct brightness level. The wash was formed using a combination of Decaling 502 oil paints, heavily thinned using standard artist's white spirit. This concoction was brushed along all the major panel lines, as well as all the rivet lines, or acting almost like a filter as well as a wash. The majority of this wash would soon be blended and removed, however, so this is far from the final effect. In order to carry out the blending stage, I first left the wash to dry for around 20 to 30 minutes, allowing the white spirit carrier to evaporate. Then, using a flat brush loaded with white spirit, I carefully began working at the excess wash in the centres of each panel, leaving it behind along the rivet and panel lines. This process consisted of a constant back and forth between the surface, a napkin, and the white spirit pot, as it was important to continuously unload the oil paint from the brush once it had picked up too much. You can see how often I'm doing this in the video. The same goes for the underside, where you can really see the effect start to take shape thanks to the lighter tone of grey used here. This was continued for the entirety of the model until all areas had been blended and manipulated. Following the oil wash, the next element of weathering that I wanted to tackle were the wing roots. As these were the most heavily chipped parts of the aircraft, it only made sense that they'd build up some grime over time, and reference pictures confirmed this. So in order to imitate it, I used some unthinned oil paints which were then blended in using a wet blender brush. This effect was built up gradually, working it into the surface and then adding more if it needed it. I also used some dust paint alongside the sepia shade, which helped to add a bit of variety to the imitation dirt buildups all along the surface. I quite liked the effect this ended up making, so I also applied it to other areas across the aircraft that would encounter grime buildups, such as around the gun bays. The next weathering effect that I dealt with were some smoke and oil leak stains, primarily focused around the spent shell outlets on the wings, as well as some engine-related outlets. These were imitated using a series of different airbrushed colours, as I often find that the smooth effect that this creates is very hard to create with oils, so resorting to an airbrush can make it much more realistic and easier to pull off. Some people use chalk, however, in my opinion, this doesn't give you the necessary control that you need for these areas. With that, the relatively short weathering stage was complete. It was now time for chapter 6 of this massive build video, which is of course time for all the finishing touches to be made. The aircraft was essentially finished at this point, with the only things left to do being some slight adjustments, as well as the addition of certain sub-assemblies. This included the cockpit door, which up to this point had been fixed in place as a masking piece using PVA glue. It was painted up and then reattached in the open position, showing off the cockpit in all of its glory. You may have noticed that the firewall in front of the cockpit hadn't been painted up to this point, so I took the opportunity to now mask it off and spray it with the same interior green shade that had been used in the rest of the build. With this done, it first allowed me to add the engine cradle, which was made back in chapter 3, through the use of multiple contact points with the firewall. This joint was actually surprisingly strong, and I encountered no issues at this stage. The same can be said for the engine itself, which was popped into the cradle and secured via 4 connection points towards the lower half of the crankcase. It's really starting to look like a proper Spitfire at this point. Other parts fitted at this stage included the skin framework around the engine, which was a little fiddly to install, but I got there in the end. Alongside this, there were some small plugs that had to be popped in around the wing roots, giving the front of the airframe a more complete appearance. These also went in without too many problems. The engine section was almost done at this stage, however the eagle-eyed among you will have noticed that the exhaust stacks haven't been added yet. These were constructed out of 2 small parts, and then primed using a well-thinned layer of AKRC black. I then loaded up a nice dark rusty tone into the airbrush, and began using this to imitate the oxidized metal that made up the exhausts themselves, making sure to focus this around the outlets. This effect was built up gradually with a couple of other tones, and then the overall effect was completed using some lighter dust pigments, which helped to finalise that oxidised appearance with some sooty deposits. I made sure to do this very soon after the painting stage, so that the paint would somewhat hold on to the pigments in place. Finally, the exhaust stacks could be added to the cylinder banks one by one, making sure to start from the back so that they overlapped properly. This was a very fun and pain-free process. Some final elements were then added, including the two massive 20mm Hispano cannons, along with the undercarriage, which was painted off camera using the same techniques shown throughout the video. The main landing gear was connected to the airframe via some really nice chunky connection points, and the join was keyed, so it was impossible to get this wrong. This was really nice to see, and it made the whole process much more straightforward and reassuring. We're almost there. Just a few finishing touches now. This included demasking the canopy glass, which was done really carefully with tweezers so as to not damage the plastic itself. It was then polished with a cotton bud, removing any remaining adhesive from the tape before being secured onto the airframe, using tiny dabs of extra thin cement. It's looking pretty snazzy at this point. Last but definitely not least, the propeller and spinner assembly was fixed onto the Merlin's air screw, finally marking the build complete. Well, here it is. After almost a year of hard work, including hundreds of hours of modelling and a month of editing, the Spitfire is finally complete. And if you'll excuse me for the self-appraisal, I think it's come out pretty nicely. And what a day for it to emerge, marking 80 years exactly since this very aircraft flew across the skies of Normandy. As a result, this aircraft is dedicated to the thousands of airmen that flew throughout Operation Overlord, keeping the skies clear for our guys on the ground. It's been an absolutely incredible experience building this beautiful kit, despite the small hiccups along the way. I've been able to test out countless new techniques in every walk of the kit building process, so I really hope you've been able to take something away from this video, even if it's just a renewed appreciation for this incredible aircraft. I sincerely hope I've done it justice, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about the build in the comments down below. With regards to the kit itself, I think I've made it pretty clear that it's fantastic. There are a few areas where fit issues did present themselves, however they're relatively easy to circumvent, producing an impressive model by the end of the build. If you were on the fence about this kit, my advice would be to go for it. With all of that said, I really hope you enjoyed this video, and a massive well done to all of you that managed to stay until the end. It was definitely an intense one. Again, a massive thanks goes out to my Modelling Weekly channel members for supporting my work throughout a relatively sparse period of uploads, as well as all of my loyal viewers for sticking around through times of inactivity. Thank you all so much. More content is already in the process of being made, so I look forward to seeing you all in the next build video. Here's to a fruitful summer full of exciting builds. Thank you all so much for watching yet again. Take care and keep on modelling. See you all in the next one. Bye.